Hello and welcome to this explainer on one of English literature's most fascinating and, let's be honest, complicated figures, John Donne. We're going to explore the absolutely dramatic story of his rise to the top and his spectacular fall from grace. And it all really begins with a single desperate line he wrote from a prison cell.
I mean, just listen to that. John Donne, and done, undone. It's this incredibly witty, heartbreaking pun that basically sums up the total collapse of his career. It's a whole life's turning point squeezed into just 6 words.
So you have to ask, right? How does a guy this brilliant end up completely ruined? Well, to get that, we have to go all the way back to the beginning, to a life that was born into conflict, where just existing was a dangerous act. So John Donne was born in London way back in 1572. And the world he entered was immediately and very aggressively hostile to his family and everything they believed in.
This, right here, this is the key tension of his entire youth. On one side, you've got the state, Protestant England, where the Queen is in charge of the church and being Catholic is seen as deeply suspicious. And on the other side, you have his family, devoutly Catholic, even related to a famous martyr. It was a constant clash that taught Donne from a very young age all about secrecy and persecution. And then, boom, at just 4 years old, his father dies. So this kid is now being raised in a family that's constantly under pressure, shaped by this really dangerous religious identity. You can see how themes of death and spiritual crisis would become so central for him later on.
Now, there was no denying that Donne was brilliant. I mean, a true genius. But as he got older, that same faith that defined his childhood would, once again, stand right in the way of his ambition.
11. Can you imagine? He was a prodigy, starting at Oxford at an age when most kids are, well, not at Oxford. He just soaked it all up. Theology, philosophy, you name it. He was building this incredible intellectual engine.
So wait a minute. If he's so smart, why did he leave not one but 2 of the best universities in the world without a degree? Well, the answer is the same old story. It wasn't about grades, it was about his conscience.
To graduate, you had to take this thing called the Oath of Supremacy. Basically, you had to swear that the English monarch, not the Pope, was the head of the church. And for a Catholic like Donne, no way. He couldn't do it. So he refused, choosing his faith over a diploma and becoming this kind of brilliant outcast.
But this is where it gets really interesting. He goes to study law, and you can see his whole poetic style being forged right there. The logic, the arguments, the witty takedowns. It's like the courtroom became the training ground for his revolutionary love poems. He learned how to argue a case, and he just applied it to love and God.
You know, this whole conflict between faith and the government wasn't just some abstract intellectual problem for Donne. In 1593, it became a devastating personal tragedy. His younger brother, Henry, was arrested for a crime that was also an act of faith, hiding a Catholic priest. It was considered treason, and he never made it out of prison. He died of the plague in there at just 19 years old.
And that quote, wow, you can just feel how this shattered him. It forced him to really question this faith that seemed to bring nothing but suffering and death to his family. This was the beginning of a long, painful journey away from his Catholic roots.
But even with all that personal turmoil, Donne was, well, he was Donne. In the late 1590s, he emerges from all this darkness as this charismatic, brilliant figure who seemed like he was on the fast track to major success.
He was living the life. He was a true Renaissance man, traveling, writing these scandalous poems that got passed around, and just dazzling everyone with his wit and charm. He was the toast of London, this magnetic personality that everybody wanted to know.
And then he gets it, the big break. He becomes the top aide to Sir Thomas Egerton, one of the most powerful guys in the entire country. This was it. He was at the center of political power, with a clear path forward. His future looked absolutely golden.
So he's at the absolute peak of his career. He has everything to lose. And right then, he makes a single, passionate decision that will bring the whole thing crashing down around him.
He falls completely in love with Anne More, and in what was a massive act of rebellion against, well, everyone, he marries her in secret. This wasn't a calculated move for power or money. It was all passion.
The consequences? Oh, they were swift and they were brutal.
Anne's father was furious, and he used all of his power to have Donne fired, thrown in jail for a bit, and his career just completely torched. In just a few weeks, he went from rising star to total outcast.
And just like that, it was all gone. No job, no powerful friends, and a new wife to support. The rising star had fallen hard. This really is the end of that first ambitious chapter of his life, ending with that one perfect word of despair, undone.
So when you look back at this first part of his life, it's just a story of these wild extremes, isn't it? He was a man shaped by conflict, by his own genius, and ultimately by one rebellious act of love that cost him literally everything he'd been working for.
And that really is the big question, isn't it? How does a man who is completely undone put himself back together to become the legendary poet we now study? Well, that transformation, that's the story of the rest of his life. And it kind of proves that sometimes a man has to be broken before he can be truly made. Thanks for joining this explainer.
Welcome to Mindsprout. You know, the life of a poet like John Donne was so incredibly dramatic, you could practically divide it into 3 completely separate parts. For our purposes today, we're going to jump right into that pivotal second act. Let's call it the story of his second life.
All right, so let's really get into this. We are talking about a guy who, for all intents and purposes, lived 2 totally different lives, back to back. I mean, on one hand, you have this ambitious, brilliant courtier and, well, a bit of a ladies' man, writing all this amazing love poetry, and then he ends up as this celebrated dean, this major religious icon whose words are still studied today.
Yeah, think about it. He was this rising star, totally on the fast track to power and influence. But somehow he pivots and becomes one of the most important spiritual voices in all of English history. So you have to ask, right? What in the world happened in between? What could possibly cause a change that big?
Well, the answer is simple, dramatic, and absolutely catastrophic. It all comes down to a secret marriage in 1601, and this one decision completely destroyed his career. I'm not talking about a minor setback here. This was a total career-ending disaster. Literally overnight, his choice to marry for love cost him everything. I mean, just look at the fallout. His high-ranking job? Gone. His salary? Vanished. Any hope for a future in politics? Completely wiped out. And to top it all off, they even threw him in prison for a little while. Just total ruin.
So he's left totally disgraced, jobless, and with this terrible reputation that's going to haunt him for years. This single event, this one moment, throws him into what we're calling his 14 years in the wilderness.
And I really want you to let that sink in. 14 years. This wasn't just a tough couple of months. We're talking about more than a decade of serious grinding hardship. For 14 long years, Donne, his wife Anne, and their ever-growing family were basically living in poverty, just trying to get by.
And get this, during this incredibly desperate time, he and Anne had 12 children. 12. He was constantly scrambling, looking for anyone who would support him financially. He even wrote this super controversial book defending suicide called By Athenos. That's how dark things got. But then, a glimmer of hope. One of his other works, a political piece called Pseudo-Martyr, somehow lands on the desk of the most powerful guy in the country, King James I. And the king, he sees something in Donne. He sees that brilliant mind.
Okay, so here's where the story takes a really interesting turn. The king is impressed, right? But he doesn't give Donne what he wants, which is a job back at court. Nope. Instead, the king basically tells him, you should be a priest. He really pressures him. And this moment, this is the turning point that begins Donne's new life as the reluctant priest.
So, feeling like he wasn't worthy, and let's be real, with basically no other options left, Donne finally gives in. In January 1615, he's ordained as an Anglican priest. I mean, look at this timeline. It's wild. 1601, his life is in ruins because of his marriage. Fast forward to 1615, and his entire life has been remade. He's on a completely new path.
But just when things are finally starting to look up professionally, his personal life gets hit by another tragedy. And this one is just devastating. Only 2 years after he becomes a priest, his beloved wife Anne, the woman he gave up his entire career for, dies. She was only 33. It happened right after she gave birth to their 12th child. Just like that, his anchor, the center of his world, was gone.
A loss like that changes a person. It made his faith deeper, more serious, and it really cemented this focus on mortality that you see in his work. In fact, you could say that it was this immense suffering that actually fueled his incredible rise to the very height of his power, becoming the famous Dean of St. Paul's.
So by 1621, he's done it. John Donne is now the Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, one of the most prestigious positions in the country. And his sermons? Oh, they were the stuff of legend. People would flock to hear him speak. Imagine it, this intense, emotional delivery, these brilliant, mind-bending metaphors, and these deep, probing questions about life and death. He had this powerful, almost theatrical presence that just captivated everyone.
And here's that theme again, right? His personal suffering leading directly to his greatest work. It's fascinating. In 1623, he gets incredibly sick, maybe with typhus, and comes right to the edge of death. And that terrifying experience? It inspired what many consider his masterpiece in prose, Devotions Upon Emergent Occasions.
And if you've ever heard the phrase, "no man is an island," well, this is where it comes from. This book is the source. Picture him, lying in his sickbed, hearing the funeral bells ringing from a church nearby, and thinking, not just about his own death, but about how all of humanity is connected. And that's when he writes these unforgettable words.
So it's just incredible, isn't it? Thinking about his own fragility, his own potential death, is what gave us one of the most powerful ideas about human connection ever. And this obsession with mortality, it wasn't just a phase. It would define the very end of his life, leading to his final and maybe greatest performance, preaching his own death.
I mean, this is just extraordinary. As he's dying, Donne decides to turn his own end into a public performance. He literally gets up from his deathbed, goes to the cathedral, and preaches one last sermon. It's called Death's Stool. Can you imagine? It was this powerful final statement on death and resurrection delivered by a man who knew for a fact that these were his last days.
But he wasn't done. To make sure his message would literally be set in stone, he arranged for one final, kind of shocking, image. He had a statue commissioned of himself, but he wasn't dressed as a powerful dean. No, he was dressed in his own burial shroud, posed as if he was already waiting for Judgment Day.
And that haunting statue? You can still see it today in St. Paul's Cathedral. It's this permanent reminder of how he faced his own end. And really, it leaves us with a pretty deep question, doesn't it? The life Donne actually planned for himself, that life of a successful courtier, it was a total failure. But that failure is what gave us this incredible, timeless art. So it makes you wonder, if a life of failure can create something so beautiful, what does that say about what success really means?
Welcome to Mind Sprout. Today, we're studying John Donne's life by dividing it into 3 halves. So let's look at that last half now. This is where we see the final, transformative decade of his life. It's a story about a man at the absolute peak of his power, suddenly forced to confront the one thing he couldn't control, his own mortality.
You know, it's a question we all have to face eventually, right? But for John Donne, this wasn't just some abstract thought. It became the central obsession of his final decade, a project he dove into with that same intellectual fire he brought to everything else in his life.
All right, so here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with Donne as England's celebrity preacher, then see how a near-fatal illness just changed everything. That experience led to his most famous writings on being connected, completely transformed his voice, and it all ends with him, believe it or not, meticulously staging his own death.
To really get the scale of this transformation, we first have to see just how high he'd climbed. By 1621, John Donne wasn't just a priest. He was a total phenomenon.
I mean, this was it, the absolute summit. As Dean of St. Paul's, Donne was at the very heart of the country's religious and political life. His voice, and I mean this quite literally, was shaping the conscience of the entire nation. And what a voice it was. In his 10 years as dean, he gave over 150 sermons. Just think about that work rate for a second. And each one was this masterpiece of philosophy, emotion, and incredible imagery. The man was relentless. And check out who was listening. When Donne spoke, the most powerful people in the kingdom packed the pews to hear him. He wasn't just preaching to a regular congregation. He was influencing public policy, royal opinion, the culture of an entire era. But right at the very height of all that fame and influence, his body betrayed him. And this wasn't just a little interruption. It was a complete shattering of his world. So for 2 years, he was at the pinnacle of power, seemed totally untouchable. And then, in late 1623, everything changed. In just a matter of weeks, an illness brought him from the pulpit of St. Paul's to the very edge of the grave, face to face with his own end. He came down with what was probably typhus, which was a brutal and often fatal disease back then. For weeks, he just lay in bed, his body wasting away, totally convinced he was going to die. But he didn't. He survived, and from that crucible of suffering, he forged something entirely new. His illness wasn't just a physical crisis, though. It became this profound spiritual and intellectual awakening. All alone in his sickbed, he had a massive revelation about what it actually means to be human. He documented the whole experience in this book, Devotions Upon Emergent Occasions. Now, what's so fascinating here is how it blends the physical with the metaphysical. He's writing about his fever, the doctor's visits, the church bells tolling for the dead, and he finds this deep spiritual meaning in every single little detail. And this quote just brilliantly captures his breakthrough. From the absolute depths of his own isolation, he realized this fundamental truth of human connection, that we are all completely, inextricably linked. The suffering of one person really does affect the whole. And that leads right to his most famous line. That church bell you hear tolling for a stranger's death, it's not just background noise. It's a reminder of our shared mortality. Every single death diminishes us, because we are all part of that same continent of humanity. So, surviving the illness didn't just return Donne to his old life. No way. It created a completely new one. He came back a changed man, with a new focus and this haunting new power in his voice. Just look at this contrast. Before 1623, his sermons were all focused outward, on public duty, social morality, authority. But after, his focus turned completely inward. He became obsessed with intense introspection, personal salvation, and the raw, unavoidable reality of suffering and death. His physical appearance changed too. He got really thin and weak, but that only seemed to amplify his message. People who heard him preach in those later years felt like they were listening to a man who had already seen the other side and had come back to tell them what he'd found. Which brings us to his final and maybe his most astonishing act. See, John Donne didn't just wait around for death. He choreographed it. He turned his own end into his final, great performance. Just weeks before he died, knowing the end was near, he got up in the pulpit one last time to preach a sermon called Death's Duel. It was, for all intents and purposes, his own eulogy. Just try to imagine the scene. The king, Charles I, is in the audience, and Donne, frail and looking like a skeleton, stands before them, not just talking about death, but actually embodying it. It must have been an absolutely electrifying and, frankly, terrifying experience for everyone there. And that sermon was just one part of his incredibly detailed preparation. He also had a statue of himself made, not as a powerful dean, but wrapped in his burial shroud, ready for the resurrection. And he spent his last days in quiet meditation, preparing his soul for the journey. And this is the epitaph he chose for that very monument. It's such a statement of ultimate confidence, isn't it? He acknowledges the reality of death, the dust, but his final word is one of absolute faith in what comes next. So, what's the ultimate takeaway from all this? Donne took his terror of death and transformed it into a work of art, a profound spiritual quest. He refused to let it just happen to him. Instead, he met it head-on, he studied it, and he ultimately tried to master it. And his journey leaves us with a pretty powerful question for our own time.